welcome to my latest video. This time I'm going to be painting a black primaris space marine. He's not from any particular chapter, I just wanted to paint a black shiny space marine. And on top of that, I didn't want him to be shiny like the standard shiny displaced space marines that you kind of see on social media and things like that. I wanted him to be a little bit less shiny, with a bit more texture and some small amounts of battle damage with scratches and things like that, while still keeping that overall shiny look. But anyway, we'll get into the painting and I'll explain what the idea is with the black armour as I go along. So starting off, we're just going to be sketching in all the highlight points, and starting here I'm using German grey. It's a Vallejo model colour paint. Don't worry about specific paint names. If you look on the wet palette there are 6 colours that I'm going to be using for the general blending of the armour. Now, you can see here 7 colours, and that pinky mess in the top left hand corner is not relevant for this video. But the other colours, I will tell you what they are, but the important thing to note is it's just 6 different tones going from black to almost white. And then later on there will be some white as well, so it'll go up to 7 tones. But it's just so that you have these different steps in the tonal range, because that makes it easy to blend as you go along. You could just have black and white, but that just makes the blending harder. So some people would just sketch straight away with white on the black, and you could do that as well, but I prefer this method to go through the stages. I can be a bit more messy, and it lets me get some texture on and things like that. So as I said, starting off with German grey, which is a very dark grey. It's only just above black. You can see on the video that it's making marks on it, but they're still very dull on the armour. By the way, we're starting the painting work over black primer, which is Vallejo surface primer black. But use any primer you want as long as it's black, or even any other colour you want, and then you can spray it black afterwards. I don't like to use brush on primer just because I like that smooth finish from the airbrush. It just reduces the chances of any kind of texture sneaking in there. So the most important part of this stage when applying the German grey is to roughly get in where you want all the light points to hit. Now I'm going to be focusing mostly on the front of the model, but you will see some other areas as the video goes along. Now what I'm kind of generally doing is looking at how the light from my lamp is hitting the model, and then adapting that to fit how I want to display the model. And what I mean by that is, so you can see generally where the light's hitting the model from the lamp. It's quite easy just to follow that. You just quickly brush in all the marks, and then you've got something that's got all the reference points that you need to work from there. And then after that, how the lamp works isn't really necessary, because I want there to be focal points on this model, and the focal points are going to be on the shoulders and on the head, and on a little bit on the chest as well. But the chest isn't too big an issue. Usually I'd say the chest is quite an important one, but in the case of this model, he has a bolt gun right over his chest, so it won't work for this particular model. But what you have to do is make the shoulders and the head brighter than the rest of the model. Now that won't show up quite as well under the lamp. It just tells you where the light points are, so you have to adapt that yourself, and that just means making the bands of highlight larger on the top sections of the model. So you can see I've just headbutted the camera there. You can see that I've very quickly gone through the transition colours. I'll just tell you what the other colours are on the palette. They're on the video description anyway, but just so that you know as you're watching the video as I go into them. So there is Vallejo model color black, that's in the top right. Next to that is German grey. Then on the bottom right there is German grey mixed with neutral grey. Next to that, to the left of that, is just straight neutral grey. Then to the left of that is neutral grey mixed with pale blue grey, and then the one in the middle is pale blue grey mixed with white. But as I said, like the actual ratios and things like that, it doesn't matter. The thing that matters is just that you have all these steps so that there's not a big jump in between each colour. And the reason, it's just so that you can quickly go between and get little transition colours wherever you need them. So if you put a mark down and it's really bright and you want to blend it in, you can just use the colour next to it, then the colour next to that, and you put them down quickly on the model and it's already blended. And you can kind of see how that's working on with the highlight points now on the model. Obviously this is taking me just a couple of minutes just to quickly block on these highlights there, but already it looks quite interesting how the light's hitting it. And you can also see how I've pushed the highlights a little bit more so that the head is brighter than particularly the lower legs. There's hardly any highlights hitting there. It's also important to remember that highlights light will catch edges more than flat surfaces, so that edges will, always stand out. And if it's in a darker area, the edge will catch the light and sometimes be quite bright, even if it's a dark area. But always balance it with how you want the model to look. Don't feel forced into looking at the reference on how the lamp is reflecting light on the model. I think that's how it has to look. If you want to have certain areas stand out more, then paint them like that. Because you're not painting by numbers. You're not filling in like outlines and it has to be exact. You're creating an art piece that you want to display. So you can see there, as I slowly put in more detail, the brush marks get slower and a little bit more considered. You can also notice that I'm not painting the eagle thing on the chest because that's going to be non-metallic gold as well. That's going to be in another video that will be posted very soon. I'm doing quite a few videos for this, so this video is how to paint the black armour. It's not going to cover the whole model because I'm painting it to a fairly high standard with all the blending and things, and it takes a long time, and I just didn't have time to record the whole model being painted in black armour. But there's enough parts completed that you'll see how you can apply it to the rest of the model. Then there's going to be a video for the non-metallic gold chest, eagle, and also has a small part on the bolt gun as well. He has a nice little purity seal. I'm going to show you how to do that, and there's all the little freehand text and things that are going to be on that, and also his leather pouch as well. But those other videos are going to be much shorter than this because they're only small sections on the model, but they're quite valuable tools, whereas this video is it's over an hour and a half long because there's obviously a lot of armour to cover. Now, if you wanted to paint like this for a tabletop standard painting, you could probably paint, well, you can see how I've painted it already. It's not quite the whole model. If you were doing it for tabletop standard, I'd probably have the whole thing stuck together already. And just do exactly the same as I've already done all over the model. It'll take you about half an hour, I think, just doing this technique like that. And it would still look pretty good. Obviously, up close, you're going to have a few faults and things, but I still think it's quite interesting. It's much quicker than edge highlighting the whole model to get to this stage anyway. And it still has a nice three-dimensional presence, and it looks like, light's hitting the model nicely. And of course, if you want to to do it for display level or something for Golden Demon or whatever, then obviously you have to spend all the hours to blend it nicely. So also, I'm not going to do the armour as just straight grey. Now there is pale blue grey in there as well, so there's a very small amount of blue in the armour highlights, which you can see, which is quite nice. It just makes it a little bit colder looking. You can see here how I've well, you can almost see how I've separately done the arm and gun that were not glued on, and obviously, as I said, I need to leave those separate so I can paint the chest eagle. But you can just see how now with the two shoulders on, how the highlights focus more on the top section of the model. And it's really nice that, you know, just creating those sort of focal points, because it's drawing your eye in and seeing the important parts of the model. One thing you will find if you're using pale blue grey is that it kind of goes very clumpy very quickly when it's on your palette. Even though it's on my wet palette, you can kind of see there already it's not very smooth like the other colours, and when you mix it in, because there is a slight amount mixed in with the other colours as well, it goes very bitty, and but it is a very dense. It's called heavy blue grey. Sorry, it's an extra opaque paint. It's very dense. It gives it a nice strong mark, but it's it will mess up very quickly. So usually what I find is if I've left it on the wet palette and I come back to it the next day, it needs a lot of mixing just to be usable again. And even then, I probably will put some fresh paint on top of it just so that it's workable. If you look at the marks I'm doing when I'm doing these little blended sections, I'm doing the brush in all sorts of directions, and that makes it much easier to get the blending to look more natural. So it looks like it's kind of a sort of a textured effect, and you can keep going over and do small marks. You know, keep applying them over and over, and eventually it becomes unified. And if you just keep doing it, and then when you glaze over it towards the end, you can remove all of those texture marks if you want, and it's just a case of how much texture you want to show through at the end. So you have complete control over it throughout the whole process. Now you can also see, like I was talking before about how the lights focus on the top part of the model. Well, this leg gets a little bit more light because it's further forward, but also because of the glazing at the end, you will be able to tone down all of these highlights. So don't worry if you go bright on any part of the model. You can control how you want it to be seen all the way up to the very end, because the glazing, you can glaze it all down, and you will see that on this model. It's that this section here will be much darker than it is at the minute. If you notice how quickly I'm working with the different tones on the palette, I keep swapping between them all. What happens is you kind of wet blending on the model, but just using one brush. It's a very easy kind of technique to do, but you do have to work quickly. But it does mean that you've always got the colours on the palette, so anytime you make a mistake, it's so easy to correct it, because you've got the whatever colour that you've got in the wrong place, you've got the colour next to it, the correct colour that you can quickly go over it with. And of course, if you do it quickly again, you can even blend it in, and you know, it just gives you much more freedom, which is the main reason why I like to get all my my colours mixed on the palette before I start. can see with these highlights, I'm being very haphazard with how I apply them. It's, as long as they're roughly in the right position, there's not a major problem. Because I say you can correct any mistake you make, and you can just keep working them in, and eventually they'll all blend together. So now you can see on the palette I've got some white there now. So this is just to do the highest points. Now don't forget, this is still the sketching stage, so all of these highlights have all got to be blended together and made neat. Now, I mean, that's if you want to. If you like the look, which I do actually quite like the sketch stage, to be honest, and if I was doing an army, I might even consider doing one like this, but I get so little chance to do actual armies that it all tends to be display level painting or close to it. You can see how the white makes such a big difference to the shininess of the model. An important thing here to look at as well is if you see on the shoulders, on the left shoulder, or well his right, our left as we look at the screen, you can see it's a little bit higher up, and I've got the light coming slightly from the left, so the light is hitting more of the corner of that shoulder pad, whereas on the to the right of the screen, his left shoulder pad, you can see the highlight is a little bit higher up because that arm is also raised slightly. It's not quite the same as the other shoulder pad, and so moving the highlight up that little bit more, actually, I mean, it just makes the model much more exciting to look at. Because it's not just a mirror, you're not just painting things as standard, you're looking at it and thinking that will be better or it would be more interesting if I paint it with a highlight there, because it looks more realistic. I mean, it might not be perfectly realistic, but it's close enough that it just makes it interesting. So every now and then you can see when I do these highlight marks, I do small gaps and things in between the lines, just like there on the collar armour and things like that. And it's just all adding little bits of like faults in the armour and like all sorts of things like that. It means that none of the lighting is perfect. If you see some things like with not perfectly finished surfaces and things like that, the light breaks up all over them, and it just catches different ways, and surrounding reflections and all sorts of things reflect light. It's very rarely that you'll get perfectly smooth, like uninterrupted lights, and also it just makes it really interesting to look at with these little marks. But of course, if you wanted to do something really shiny and smooth, a good example of that would be Gareth Nicholas. He does amazing, really smooth, like perfect space marines, and you see how he does reflections on those. There's no faults in the blending. There's no faults in any of it. The armor would be perfectly smooth, whereas this style is more like something that's been knocked around a bit while still being shiny. So now you've got the rough idea. Everything's been sketched in on the front at least, and now it's time to blend these highlights in and have a little, a bit more precision about how you want the lights to look. It's time to refine the model basically. It's very much a mid stage. The glazing is where all the magic happens as such. That's where you get that finished look. But what you should see is I'm using very small marks, lots and lots of them, and just kind of, it's almost like stippling and it will just blend all these different layers together. But also it's at this stage where you're kind of adding or removing highlight placement so that it it looks more how you want it to, whereas the early stage is much more sketchy and you've probably got a few mistakes down there while you're doing it. It's also at this stage that you'll see that I'm going to add in secondary highlights. Now, the thing with secondary highlights is they're very hard to see on the model. If you're holding it under the lamp, they're not going to be very visible to you. You have to work out where you want them to be. And generally, I'm putting them on anywhere where it's black. And don't do the secondary highlights as bright as the primary highlights. They're secondary, they're not supposed to attract the attention, they're as added detail and visual interest. The highlights are where it draws your eye, and then the secondary highlights are where your eye looks afterwards when it's like, oh, look at all the nice details around it. So things like this little highlight under the round kneecap, and at the bottom of the kneecap as well. They're going to be much duller than the highlights next to them. But as I said earlier on, it doesn't matter if you might accidentally go a little bit bright on the secondary highlights, because again you can glaze them down. You'll find that neutral grey will be your main colour that you keep going back to blend the different tones together. Be very careful with the highlights that are higher than neutral grey, because obviously they make very bright marks, and then they're harder to work down again. So that little highlight there is in the joint where the curve meets the flat edge on the kneecap. It's quite an important line there. Normally you would think, oh, there's only a highlight on the curved surface. But if you, hopefully when you hold the model under the lamp, you should be able to see that actually you get a highlight right in the crease point. And hopefully as well when the model's finished, or this section is finished at least anyway, it'll look natural to you and you'll see actually, yes, that's correct, there's supposed to be a highlight there. And then it's things like that with give you the benefit of or you'll receive the benefit from looking at a reference, because it might not be something you would otherwise think of including. So you should also notice here on this kneecap is that the highlights are in a roughly circular pattern. That's because the armour is circular as well, so that's why the highlight is circular. The highlights tend to form to the shape of the armour, and that's why doing curved surfaces are more fun. Right, so there we are after I've spent a little bit of time blending the kneecap together. Don't worry, because there was a time jump there. I just wanted to do one first before I spend more time on the model showing it. So you will get to see in other parts. All over the model the different highlight techniques. Or rather, the same technique used in slightly different ways depending on the shape of the armour. You probably will find the legs are the hardest part, mainly because they're a bit bigger, so it takes so the blending area is larger basically. If it's a small area, you only need very small amounts of paint to blend the pieces together, and it's very small steps, whereas on the bigger pieces, if you still want those smooth transitions, you can't just do big steps because it'll be a very obvious line in between each tone. You can kind of see that the tones I've already just started blending them, but that's where the stippling technique really comes into its own, because you can cross over the steps and kind of stipple them together, so that, and also because of the paint transparency combined with the stippling, and once you've done it enough, they will just look like they've merged together. So there I was just using the German grey. Just to blend in the edges. You can see when I first applied them, they were very roughly sketched in. Also, for blending the colours, you'll see that I'm not cleaning up the brush that often, so that will give you, even though there are only small steps and tone in between each of the paint mixtures, by using one mixture and then directly going to the next one, it'll create even more blending options, because the paint will mix on the model and on the brush. I'm using a size 0 Artist Opus brush for this one. And again, you don't need to use a size 0, I just enjoy it for this particular thing. I'm only using the tip of the brush anyway, so. And because I'm changing the paints all the time, actually a larger brush could be a bit more of a hindrance, because you would retain more of the paint on it. So if you wanted to mix on another colour, it's going to make less impact because there'll be so much paint from the original colour already on there. So there you can see I dipped the brush into that's the mixture between the neutral grey and the German grey, but when I applied the mark it was still quite light, and that's because the previous colour had been I think the pale blue grey. You can also see every now and then I keep wiping the brush from my hand. That does two things. One, that again starts to help the paint mix on the paintbrush, but it also keeps it into a sharp point. You don't want it to be a case of you're putting the paintbrush on the palette and then going straight to the model, because it'll put a lot of paint straight down, it'll blob onto it. One, that'll be too much paint, it'll be very thick, so you're risking getting a horrible uneven textured surface. And two, you just have a lot less control over what you're doing because there's so much paint there. Now you might notice I keep changing my mind a little bit of how I want the highlight to look here, and that's mainly because I'm trying to decide how shiny I want the surface. If you look at the knee, because that's already been pushed a little bit further ahead, that is quite shiny, but I don't really want the leg to be such a visual impacting part of the model. you should be able to see roughly how the highlight's starting to come together now. And it's a little bit lighter at the bottom as the leg flares out, and just the light catches that rim a little bit. Because again, as it's a hard edge, the light will catch it more. Be very limited when you apply the white, just in very small areas. Don't go too mad with it, because it's much harder to blend in, and if you use too much of it, it takes away the impact. The less you use of it, when you do apply it, it has a stronger impact. And it actually reinforces that it's very dark armour, because it creates that high contrast against the dark areas. So you're using pure white, it obviously contrasts against the dark. So here I'm just glazing on Abaddon black. However, there are two other colours that I will be glazing on. One is Mournfang brown and the other is Xereus purple, and they're both quite important, and it's just to give, again, interest to the armour. Now you've got to be very careful how you apply them, because you don't want the armour to be brown and you don't want the armour to be purple, and that's why you're using the black glaze as well, because that really softens into the primer, the black primer at the base. And also, this is a really important point, when glazing, you're glazing away from the highlight. So just watch as the brush touches the model. It starts near the highlight. Never glaze over the white, because it'll tone it down. It's most likely to look messy if you glaze over the white with a really dark colour. If you want to glaze over the white, you need a colour much closer to white, so the pale blue grey or maybe neutral grey, but even neutral grey is quite dark in comparison. So when you apply the glaze, start near the highlight and then move down into the shadow. I can't say this enough. Also, when the brush leaves the model, there will be more paint left than where you touch the model. The surface tension of the water drags the paint along, and as you release the brush from touching the model, there's a small puddle left behind. That's a very small puddle, but it does, and in that puddle will be more pigment than in the start area, so you're pushing into the shadows. And there you can see, now again, I'm going to show you how to paint the helmet with all the colours on, but you can see how I've added the Xereus purple and the sorry, it wasn't Mournfang brown, it was Rhinox hide that I glazed onto the leg. But again, because I'm painting this model with the colours for the first time, I want to double check as I'm doing it. So you will see all the glazing in other parts of the model, but while I have the plan, I need to double check how it works. You can see how all the paint's been starting to dry on my wet palette as well. I mention this all the time about my wet palette. I do actually enjoy it. It is the red grass, whatever it's called. It's a red grass wet palette. But the problem is, because it's so shallow, the water evaporates quickly. If you've left it open for a few hours, you probably need to refill it with water. So this small segment is going to be entirely painting the helmet. As I've mentioned, the head is a focal point for the model, so there'll be a little bit more time spent on this, but because it's a smaller area, it's much more focused painting. So So this highlight here, this is the most important highlight on the model. It's the one that catches your eye and really draws your attention to the head. And that highlight, I mean, is the one on the forehead, not on the little mohawk type thing on top of it. But again, because that's next to it, it has to work with that highlight as well. For these highlights, so he's got little holes in his breathing apparatus, and for a start on, you want to cover the area where the light's catching. But when you're putting in the sharp edge highlights, it's always the underside that will catch the light most. Well, I mean, I say the underside. It's the edge that's facing upwards. You should hopefully understand and see what I mean when as it goes along. What you might find is that the head looks very grey. There's a lot more light paint on the helmet than anywhere else in the model. And taken on its own, that makes the helmet quite pale. But remember that the helmet is part of the whole model, so you have to take it all into account when you're doing it. I apologise for headbutting the camera. So you can see how much more easy it is to blend on the helmet because it's a small area, and also it's a nice curved surface as well. So the highlight point kind of does it for you, because it draws your, like, you kind of can see where the light would focus to on that point, you know, just there where the brush touched. And also there are these edges, and again the light would catch those a lot. But it's quite important that there's a dark line left between the edge of the mohawk part. I don't know what any of these things are called. The top block on the helmet and the curve of the helmet underneath. It's very important there's that dark line, because that creates the contrast and the detail on the model. There's another sharp line down the centre of the front of the face. And again, that's to help define all the detail. Later on in this video, you will see that I've painted in the little tubes that come out of the mask, and they'll be painted in a chrome type effect. I don't actually cover those in this video because I'm going to be painting the gun in another video, well, a part of it anyway, and I'll show you how to do the chrome on that. But it's very simple anyway, so don't worry if you think, oh, I don't know how to do that, I've missed it. That will be covered as well. So you can see here, I am, in a way, it's edge highlighting, but it's kind of reduced edge highlighting. So I still want the light to do all the work. I don't want to define every edge as being the same thickness in highlight. Some will be brighter and some will be darker and things like that. It all depends on how you want the the focal points to work. If you do every edge highlight to the same highlight level, then everything has the same focal point. Whereas I'm just picking out these edges so that it's still defining details on the model, but then I'm using like slightly darker colours just to to do those edges. I hope it all makes sense. Right, so here we can see how I'm glazing in the colours, and this is the Xereus purple, and this just gives that lovely sort of it almost adds to the metallic-y kind of look to the model, but it does blend the tones together as well. Every time you see me pause, that's because I'm blowing on the model to help dry up the process. Some people like to use a small hairdryer. In theory, you shouldn't really need a hairdryer that much for glazing, because the coats are supposed to be very, very thin. So they should dry, quite quickly. I'm just going back here with the pale blue grey to just neaten up a couple of the highlights. And there in the well, you can see the three glaze colours. So in the brownish looking one, that's the Rhinox hide, next to that is Xereus, and then to the right of that is the Abaddon black. Here I'm using neutral grey just to pick out the lower edge on the well, just above the eyes. And again, if you get the highlight a little bit too bright, don't worry, again, you can glaze over it. Glazing can fix a lot of the issues of things when you go too bright. It's a little bit harder to fix them if you go too dark, so it's always better to be a little bit too bright and glaze it down rather than be too dark and try and glaze it up, because glazing up takes a long time. So you may think, why am I painting the edge? Because it's facing downwards. But you will find that light catches edges even if they're facing down, but not to such a degree as if they're facing up. If you look below this edge, you see it's much brighter on under the eye than it is above the eye. And again, I'm just tweaking it a little bit, so it's not necessarily perfectly accurate for how light works, but so it draws the attention to the eye, because what happens is when the eye is painted in, there's still a black line that goes all the way around the eye, and because there's a black line, then by having that slight highlight just above it, that's more contrast, again defining the eye and drawing your attention to that area. Keep going back to this bit. I'm not sure if you can quite see in the video, but there was a small dot on there that wasn't quite smoothly painted on. Then I'm going back to the I think it was German grey and neutral grey mixture, just to soften it down a little bit as well. So you can see just that small little white dot there really makes it look like there's a light shining on the helmet. But because on this face mask bit at the front, because there's a larger area of light there, and I put more white on it, it doesn't look as shiny even though there's more white on that part. So that just reinforces what I was saying earlier, with the more sparing you can be with the white when you apply it, the more it'll stand out. And then again, just picking out those highlights on the lower section of the upward facing edges on the whatever they are, the ventilation parts on the face mask. So now I'm going to try and blend this in a little bit, because I found that the white dot, although it looked quite nice, I still need the head to be a bit brighter than or lighter than the rest of the model. At this point, I think it's a 0-0 brush I'm actually using. You don't actually, I always say that, you don't actually have to use specific brushes. In some ways, for me, it's a mental process. So the smaller that I use a brush, it kind of, and I can see that the whole of the brush is smaller. So it just kind of reinforces to me that I'm doing fine detail with the brush. You can do the same thing with most, with the points of most of these brushes for this kind of blending, but one, it keeps you using all the separate brushes so that you're not wearing one out quicker than the others, but again, it just forces you to focus a bit, and you can only get so much paint on these brushes as well, so you're much less likely to overload the brush and get too much paint on the model. You can see how fine the tip is, just for making very small marks. So now what I'm going to do is wreck all of the the neat work that I've been doing by putting these small kind of scratches on the model. Now I'm going to use neutral grey, and possibly neutral grey mixed with a bit of pale blue grey, but never higher than that. You don't want bright highlights for these scratches. I'm going to glaze over them anyway, so they blend in a little bit. So what I'd say for when picking between the neutral grey or the neutral grey mixed with the pale blue grey is how close it is to the highlight point. If it's in a really dark part of the model, if it's really shadowed, just use neutral grey, because you don't want it to stand out too much. It'll be too high contrast. You're going to glaze over it anyway, and you'll see here that they really fade into the background, but they're slightly visible. It is a thing only for display level pieces. You won't be able to see this on the tabletop, but when you look closely at it, or you do big blown up photos like you see on Facebook or wherever, it makes it more interesting to look at then. So here I'm just going and redefining that black line between the mohawk part and the curved part of the helmet. So here's the helmet stuck back on, and you can see that I've painted on the little chrome sections and the blue eyes. As I said, the chrome sections will be in a separate video. I didn't record how to do the eyes because there's not really any special process to it. All I did was use P3 blue base, and I painted the eyes blue. I used Lothern blue, painted the lower edge, just one line, lower edge, as neatly as I could, and then a white dot in the corner, and that was it. It's a very standard process. I think everyone paints their eyes the same way on Marines. And because it's a small area, it looks like it's blended. You're using two blues anyway, so they're not a million miles away from each other. And it just all works nicely that way. But yeah, there's nothing fancy about the eyes. So now you've seen all the steps basically on the head for the highlighting and the glazing and the weathering, and then that process is then carried out over the whole model. Now obviously some of the shapes are different, so it might be interesting to see how it's done, say on the shoulder, because from the angle, the forward angle on the model, before I've put the highlights, there's not the sharp hard curve of the head like there is on the head. There's not on the shoulder, sorry. So it won't be quite as it won't be quite highlighted the same way, but the whole process is exactly the same. As you use all the small marks, you blend the highlights together, then you a little bit of glazing, a few neutral grey scratches and things, and then glaze over it again, and just keep looking at how you want it to look. I think from this angle here you can see really nicely how on the head, the highlights mixed with those small scratches glazed in, it just adds a lot more realism to the piece. I found this arm a little bit trickier because it's actually not, the shapes aren't that well moulded actually. On the forearm, the little, whatever it is, little computer area, as it curves around, it's actually very soft and curvy and not sharp and obvious at all, and because of that it's much harder to pick out how the shape is supposed to look. And in case anyone's wondering, what you see the little skull face that's looking up at you there, it's a Wrathcore model holder designed by Stephen Rath. I get so many questions on what that is. Someone even asked if that was the light for the OSL on the armour. It's not far off the right point actually, but no, it's just to help hold the model so that you don't get your finger touching the model. And no, that's not paid advertisement. I got these off Kickstarter. So one thing you have to decide when doing these sort of highlights, if you look at the elbow, the curve of the elbow is split into two sections with that line down the middle. Now you have the option of having the light covering both sections. In that case, it makes it very hard to see the line down the middle, and you can run into problems doing it that way. Or you can do it like I'm doing here and just have one section, so you've got the nice contrast. It makes it very clearly defined that there's two surfaces on the elbow joint. But because you're painting on highlights, obviously as you turn the model, the light's not going to move, so it might look strange that there's not a highlight on the same point on the rear section of that elbow. Now you just have to decide if you're going to live with that or not. I haven't actually decided at this point. I've still got a little bit more on the model to do, and I might add some highlights on that section, but at the moment I'm going to go with keeping it dark, and I think it just contrasts nicely. You know, with the highlights and the creating the whole shape of the armour. Now, one thing that I did here, you can see on the back of the hand holding the gun, I've just it's mostly edge highlight with a little bit of curve below it. Now, that's fairly accurate for how the light hits it, but someone pointed out to me it looks a little bit plain in comparison to the rest of the arm, and I was going to leave it until I'd done more of the gun, because obviously the whole model has to balance together, but I decided that I would quite like that flat bit just to have a little bit more highlight. So what you'll see by the end of the video is that hand has been tweaked slightly, and again, because I've got all the paints on the palette, you know, with all the tones and everything, it's really easy to just make changes. You know, when you see the model, you're like, oh, I just want a little tweak there or whatever. You can just quickly, because most of the blending's already done by that stage anyway, so you just take, you know, do a little bit, extend the highlight or whatever, quick couple of glazes, and it still looks as finished as before. It only takes a few minutes. So I would really recommend getting quite a few paints on your palette just to let you change things on the fly. It just gives you much more freedom. So with things like the arm as well, what you'll find is it's a much more complicated shape. Now, the beauty of marines is, and one of the reasons, probably the main reason actually, why people like to paint shiny marines, but the same thing works for the Stormcast Eternals as well, but not quite to the same extent, is that they're very simple shapes, large smooth surfaces with nice curves on. It makes it really easy to pick out the highlight points, and you know, make things look shiny quite simply. And the more detailed an area is, the harder it becomes to work out where all the highlights go, and just, you know, to get all the, you don't get the option to have a nice simple blend into a highlight point. So that's why you see lots of shiny marines, is because it's easier. And not just easier, but it looks better shiny. And you know, if you covered this whole thing in detailed filigree, it suddenly becomes a nightmare. You can't blend things easily. You just have to pick every detail out. And I mean, like sculpted on filigree. And it's one of my big bugbears with models at the minute becoming more and more detailed. I like smooth, blank surfaces that just give me the option. I mean, you can paint on the details if you want, but otherwise it gives you the option to have something to contrast against details on the model. So this is nice because there are small detailed areas, like so there's the chest eagle thing, and there's a rope on the shoulder, and things like that. But you know, just overall, it's a very clean model. And just getting back to the arm, because that's where all this started. So there are extra plates on there. There's that little wiggly bit with the two buttons or lights or whatever they are in there. So it just makes it a little bit harder to get the highlights right. But I mean, it's not a major point. And as I said, I just like the detail to be a little bit sharper there. Whereas places like the head, they're perfect with. There's a bit of detail at the front, but it's next to a smooth area, and so it creates some nice contrast as well. Just as an aside, if you're wondering why there was a slight pause and I may have become incoherent, there was a doorbell, so I've had to edit that out, and I lost my train of thought, so apologies for that. So you can see here I'm still working on the arm, and just blending it in. So I keep going backwards and forwards by what could be seen as quite a few steps actually. So even though a section's been glazed in, I then will go back and use some paint on it as well, and that doesn't matter either. Don't feel pressured to go through steps. It doesn't have to be dark to light to light to lighter, then the chips and things, and then glaze it, and then done. You can go highlight, glaze, highlight, chips, glaze, highlight. You know, it doesn't matter. Just whatever the effect. You know, so it takes a little bit of practice because you need to kind of be aware of the marks you're going to make. But if something doesn't look right, or you just want to change it, or for whatever reason, don't be afraid to go back and mix the stages together, because as long as you're using the different techniques with the glazing and the layering and things like that, they will all work. And it doesn't matter if there's slight variations in it throughout the model, because again, it's just adding interest. As long as it's all roughly similar, it'll all work together. So you just saw me there putting on some little nicks along the edge of the armour. Those are actually really nice. What you'll find as well is in sections like on the arm, and you can see in this thing here, and especially on the back of the hand as well, edges will attract more damage. While the damage on this model isn't particularly heavy, I do want it to be visible while subtle. So still keeping the edges fairly clean, just adding lots of nicks on the edges, it just makes a big difference. You know, to the cleanliness of the model. Now, the video is getting a bit ahead of me, but I do want to cover something just important actually. The more detailed the area is, like on the arm that was just taken off, when you put on those edge nicks, it will make that area look much more damaged than on the large area that will have fewer edge nicks. Now that's you have to balance it a little bit, so, and it didn't matter too much in this model because that's getting towards the top of the model where I want the focal points to be. But just be aware of that it can, on a more detailed area, if you just try and automatically cover all the edges in nicks, it can be overpowering. So look at it carefully as you're applying it. Don't just do it because the edges get nicks. So anyway, getting back to the video, you can see how I've carried on working on a few sections, like on the shoulder pad. Now what I'm going to do is go back to the other leg, because the first one's had a lot more work done on it, and I'm going to go through the whole process again on this leg. Now this leg is darker than the other one. It's a little bit more underneath him, and I don't want it to be a strong focal point at all. So hopefully you'll see a little bit of how that works, along with still seeing the same processes. So again, you've seen this all the way through. You can also see that this is on a separate day that I'm painting it, because the paints are now different on the wet palette. But it's still all the same colours. Or I might have missed one of the mixtures out, which isn't important. And I said this at the beginning of the video, but I just want to reiterate it now. The exact mixtures don't work as long as you've got enough steps in the variations of the tones. It just gives you the option to use whichever tone that you need at the time. Close enough. anyway, and then the marks that you make help to blend them together. So you can see here on this this trim bit, this is another important part, is that the highlights should match up, or kind of roughly anyway. So shapes of materials and things like that can bend the lights a bit, but they should still roughly line up. You can see there, it's very dark in the video, but I'm using again German grey to create the secondary highlight on the underneath of the shin pad, which is what I did on the first one. They're quite difficult to see in the video, just because it is so close to black, and again because it is for display level models, so it's not something that you're ever going to see on the battlefield. It's quite hard to see when if you're just glancing at the model. It's something that really you only see from like about 7 or 8 inches away. So, but it's very satisfying to see it when you see your model up close. And that's another important thing to remember. All of the marks that you see, if something looks a little bit wrong, if you put your picture on Facebook and you can see, oh, there's a paintbrush mark there. That's just something I suffer with, because I'm always like, oh, I've done that wrong. But if you look on the model, you can't see the mark. But remember, if you're seeing a picture that's blown up 3 or 4 or more 100%, these marks will be visible, but to the naked eye they're probably not. So don't be too hard on yourself when you see faults in the models when you're looking at the photographs that but it is a really good tool. And what I like to do is I take a photograph of my model, and then I'll put it on Instagram, and then I can pinch to zoom and look in, and I can spend time looking at it and look for all the faults, or even just take a photo of the model and have it on my PC screen. But it will let you see things that you need to work on that you might not notice while you're painting it, just by looking at it with your naked eye. So this secondary highlight here on the flat side or the forward-facing flat side of the trim on the knee, this is a kind of like a bounced light from the round light on the knee, and because that's the brightest point, then this then lines up with that brightest point, and as it reflects back and just creates a very soft little glow on the underside. But also, so these secondary lights, they're coming from all sorts of places. What you will find, and when I finish the model anyway, but there will be some on this leg actually, especially on the inside, is that you'll get bounced light from the floor. And again, that should be very, very pale, but it just adds a bit more depth to the piece. It grounds it, rather than having just something can be completely blank. It adds detail to the model, again, visual interest, all sorts of things. So it's definitely worth doing. So it's actually quite a tricky area to paint in here. It's a secondary highlight I'm painting in, and this is just as I was mentioning, actually, the light from the floor catching it, but also it's right next to where the tip of the purity seal is coming to the leg, so it can work as a reflection for that as well. But I haven't actually, because I haven't painted the purity seal yet, the colours won't be right for that. So it might be a case of, when I paint in the purity seal, I'll paint in a little bit of bone or ivory or whatever I decide to do with it, reflecting on the armour. because obviously whatever colour it is what colour will reflect to a certain extent, depending on the material and all sorts of things like that. But yes, because this is one thing where model holders can have issues, and that's the painting on the inside of legs and things wherever the model is attached to the holder, because it's in effect trying to paint the model with a base on it. Now, if that base wasn't there, if you're just holding the model loosely, you'd have much greater access. But again, that risks damaging the paintwork and just getting you the grease on your fingers and things like that. So for this case, I'm handicapping myself by using the model holder, but you know, it's your choice if you want to use it or not for getting into these tricky areas. One thing I will say though is using the model holder will keep the model more stable. You can see there the neutral grey in the middle of the wet palette. It's starting to separate a little bit, and you can see kind of like warm colours and things like that in it. I'm not sure what they've used to make the colours, but it seems more of a warm grey in that picture than a truly neutral grey, but it works for the purposes of this armour. So here I'm just painting the upper edge on the lower leg. Now this is another important part. As I've mentioned a few times, edges will catch the light more in darker areas, that they'll stand out, and that's also a good excuse to define the details. So I've used neutral grey because, as I mentioned, I don't want these areas to be super bright. I don't want them to overpower the highlights. Like if I painted that as a white highlight line, even if it was super fine, it would then be competing with the highlight on the top of the kneecap, and you know, it makes them equal in highlight. Whereas this way, you've still got the highlight there, you've still got the detail and definition, but it's working with the lighting that you're using on the model, rather than having all the highlights fighting against each other. I did notice on this part of the model actually that it wasn't a perfectly smooth curve underneath there, so it was a bit annoying to get a straight line, or rather a smooth line, and that's why there was a couple of flicks there in the video as I got irritated and had to focus on doing it. And here you can see I'm going to paint a highlight on the outer edge. Now it's going to turn out quite bright for a start, but by the time I finish glazing it, it becomes nearly invisible. Now the reason for that is because it's another issue with this primary light source style technique. Now it works all right from a small angle of viewing the model, but as you turn the model more, then the effect isn't as effective. So what you have to do is paint highlights from multiple angles, but you have to do it in a way that they don't intrude on the primary. So if I paint the model from the front, then if I turn it 90 degrees, then I can paint highlights however I like. But then if I change back to the front viewing angle, I can't have those new highlights being visible, because then they'll look wrong from the front. So there's always a slight fudge that you have to kind of tweak the highlights so that they work, so you can look at the model from any angle, and then the highlights still work all the way around. And also, the best way I find is, so you'll pick the front and the back as the two primary ways to view the model, because that gives very strong, definite light sources, especially with this, where you want the strong light source coming from, well, it's slightly to the left of above, and because you can see that from looking at the model. If you turn it to the side, it then looks silly if you've got highlights on that side that are really bright, because you're like, well, that's not where the light's coming from. So do the front and the back first, and then you can do those really accurately, and then at the sides you just have to wiggle it a bit and to make it look kind of interesting. Now, of course, there are other options. You could paint the model to be shiny from as if it was lit from 4 or 5 directions at the same time, but then you would never get the lighting effect where with the one spot and coming down hitting the head, you would get multiple spotlights on the head. So it really does depend on the look you want. And the other benefit from this is, obviously, you can use the light and dark for the contrast and the shape of the model, which again relies on having a dark side to the model. So the secondary highlights are adding interest, and generally for this model, once I've done the front and the back, when I do the sides, the left side of the model as you're looking at it, so his right side, that's going to have higher highlights on, because that then works with the rest of the model. And then on the dark side, which will be the right of the screen as you're looking at it, they're all just going to be secondary highlights with the odd bit of detail picked out. But what that will mean is, when you just look at the right at the right screen side of the model, is it might look a bit dull and boring from that angle, but that's just the way it's got to be. So then you have to do your best to make it visually interesting. And what I'll be doing on that side of the model is adding freehand to the shoulder pad to make it interesting. I mean, there are all sorts of ways that you can overcome this issue. You can turn it into a small diorama. And you can even put like scenery around it, so that you only see the model from one angle, and all sorts of things like that. I mean, if you wanted something brightly lit and the material isn't supremely shiny, you can have it shiny all the way, like you can have it light all the way around, and it won't interfere quite as much. But because if you want those shine points, then you can't really have it all the way around. You have to pick certain angles. So anyway, back to the video. You can see we're now doing some of the small marks on it, the little weathering marks. And what happened there was, I took the brush, I put the model down, I took the brush away because I was getting a bit of dry tip on the brush. So the important thing with these marks is that they are really, really fine. You can do little dots, lines. Don't do too many crossed lines. Again, they're like putting little kisses over your model. I see so many people put these little crosses everywhere, even if they might just do one piece of damage and suddenly it's a cross on that piece of damage. It's like, why did the one piece of damage suddenly get a cross on it? It looks silly. You will never see that in reality of just little crosses all over things. So try and keep it random looking, and just put these little marks all over, but keep them as fine as you can, because then that will reinforce the scale of the model. The bigger you do the detail, the more you destroy the illusion. One thing you might see on this, separate from that, moving on the belly, it's not really highlighted up yet properly, but you can see it's fairly bright. Now this is wrong, because obviously the gun goes over that, so there's hardly going to be any light reaching that point. But and this is where a little bit of artistic interpretation comes in, and again it's going to be the same for the dark side of the model that I was talking about, but just to make it a bit more interesting, I'm putting this the light is going to be glazed down, so it's not going to be as bright as it is, but there's still going to be a certain amount of light that I put in there that normally wouldn't be that visible, just to make it interesting, so it's not just a black section on the model. So originally I wanted to paint this model as a Raven Guard, but because the model I'm using is supposed to be a veteran sergeant, he would have a white helmet, and I wanted the whole model to be really desaturated and also have focal points with lighting, and if it was a white helmet, that would just it would defeat the whole point of doing it, making it, the head highlights brighter, because it'd already be really bright anyway. So I might still turn him into a Raven Guard, but he's not going to be a veteran sergeant, and he just happens to have purity seals and a sword and whatever else. I wasn't overly concerned with those sort of details at the time, but if I do decide to enter into a competition, those kind of things will be important. So he may end up with a raven skull on his shoulder pad. Okay, so there's quite a bit of the front done now. You've seen a lot of the process already. And what I'm going to do now is the big central disc on the back of the backpack. You can see where I've quickly sketched in some of the highlight points mainly on the lower legs and on the backpack, because again those will be the areas that catch the most light and attention. There's not so much issue with focal point on the back. No one cares about the back of your model really. But it is important to paint it well, because if it's being put in a competition, it will be marked down if you painted it badly. So you can see I started off, I already had the sketch, and you saw at the very beginning of the video how the sketch worked. You just quickly block in where you want all the highlights to go. So now it's straight onto the blending them together, and also because it's quite a large disc, I'm going straight into adding the secondary lower highlight, because the disc curves down underneath. So this will be a highlight of just light reflected from the floor coming up. It won't be super bright, but it just add that little bit of definition to the whole piece, because if you don't have that highlight there, then it just drops off into black at the bottom, and again would be quite boring. Now if you wanted to do something with a diorama piece maybe, and just have one lighting hitting the model and you're just viewing the whole scene from one direction, then it might be interesting to just have one side of the model be completely black without any reflected highlight. You could do some quite interesting things with lighting and stuff like that. But for the purpose of this, where the model has to be viewed from lots of angles, then you do have to just think of these ways to make the model look interesting. And remember, the highlight points have to line up again, so the little outline on around the disc has to follow the same highlights as the disc itself, but because the outline is a hard edge, it just catches the light a little bit more. Usually if you're painting an edge like that, I recommend that you just, well, obviously you have to use the tip of the brush, but just the side of the tip of the brush and only a small amount of paint on it, and then you can drag that along the edge and you'll get a very fine line, and it's easy job done. But sometimes you'll find, I can't remember if it was the case with this edge highlight or not, but the details of other parts of the model are very close to the edge, and if you try using the side of the brush, you'll start painting onto the other details as well, in which case you have to use the very tip of the brush and just be really neat. Also, one disadvantage of doing edge highlights like that is obviously it creates a very fine sharp edge, but all of the edge highlights on the model have to be like that. So if you're painting straight freehand lines on for edge highlights, they have to be as fine and sharp as the sharp edge highlights that you've just quickly done using the side of the brush. So just be aware of that. Make sure that things match all over the model, because as I mentioned, some areas, even if it is a nice edge, you can see your brush strokes might be restricted, so you might not be able to use the side of the brush to get those nice highlights in. Also on the back of this, on the backpack on the disc, you can see here that I'm painting in now. There are 4 small little rivet things, and then with cutouts around them. So these would obviously catch the light more. Again, it's an edge, so you get an edge highlight, and focusing on the lower edge, catching more light. You can see again I'm using the neutral grey colour. Now the rivets, I actually end up painting a little bit brighter again. They're circular and very small, so they will just catch light from any direction, which will make them brighter. And then just blending in a little bit that German grey highlight. Probably using neutral grey at the very lowest point, because it's like a reverse highlight on the light coming upwards. So it hits the lowest point first, so that's the brightest area. So as you can see, this style of blending, it's lots and lots of very small controlled marks. But that works because you've got so much of the colour down at the sketching stage. So, I mean, you could do it straight onto the black, picking out the highlights like that and doing lots and lots of small marks, but it would take a lot longer. And then here we are for the pure white on the top rivet, the top of the edge, and just at the very bottom of the cutout. And they all line up. So here you can hopefully see the glazing. I've tried to get some of the kitchen roll in there, so you should see a better idea of how I work with the glazing. So this is Rhinox hide. There's no hard and fast rule for how which order you apply the colours and things like that. If you want it more purple, have the purple higher up on the highlight levels, because it'll be much more visible going over the light greys than on the blacks. But even then, because it's lighter than a black, as you glaze over it. Oh, by the way, when I take it off the screen, I'm not painting anything on it. I'm blowing on it to dry it. But there you can see with the purple glazed on, it just adds that little hint. And the reason that I've gone purple and brown is if you mix them together, you get almost black. In this case, the purple has obviously got something else in with it. It's because it's a light colour, it's got a little bit of white in there or something. But it's just enough so that it tints the black as well. And then if you go with the brown over that, if you glaze too much with the purple, it then takes away the black. If you glaze over those areas with the brown, it'll darken them down again, but it's adding kind of interesting colours in there. So if you look closely, you can kind of see hints of purples and browns, but it's still really dark. And then you can still go over it again with the black in those really darkest areas if you just want to create even more contrast. So you can see I started by doing a couple of glazes, and then I'm adding little scratches on at this stage. So it's like I mentioned before, don't feel constrained to do certain marks at certain times. If you wanted, you could do a little bit of glazing straight after the sketching stage if you want, just to get some colours in there. I mean, it's probably not that worth it because you've still got to blend them together, but don't feel like you're doing something wrong. If it creates a mark that you like, then you might want to keep it. The sketching stage can be really important for keeping marks on the model that you don't want to lose, and you say, well, I'm just going to keep it like that and glaze it down, smooth it in just using glazes. I'm not going to do all the small little marks on there, and that can work too. So I use a slightly larger brush when I do the glazes. It's getting a bit worn out now as well, which is it just lets me do softer marks with the very tip. So that's the size 1 that I'm using for the glazes. So it goes from 0.0 for the fine detail damage, and then onto the glazing, which is then swapped over to a size 1. Or you can use bigger as well. It all works nicely, but larger brushes tend to be nicer for glazing. And the reason for that is you want to use as few strokes as possible. You can see that I use more than I should, but I'm being quite controlled in how I do it. But if you could do it in one stroke, it looks better. So using kind of almost like your edge highlighting actually. So using just the tip, but the edge of the tip rather than the whole brush. But you can see as well that I sometimes apply it as almost a stipple again, and that's I'm looking at the model and seeing where it needs the paint applying or the glaze applying. And that could be that one of the scratches is too bright and I need to dull it down or something like that. So this is what I've done for the whole of this video. And I hope you found it informative and enjoyed watching. I will be going over how to do the chrome, as I mentioned in another video, so don't worry that you've missed that. But that should give you everything you need to know, and how to do the black effect on Space Marine power armor, or indeed any other kind of armor. Thank you very much for watching.